Also, it's the device. All right. All right. Sounds good. Thank you. All right. All right. How is everybody? Sorry about that. Apparently, it is a device issue. All right. Let's see where we are here. Morning, everybody. Morning to the Freedom family. Turnkeys, mergers and acquisitions. Oh my. Let's see. Let's see what we're doing here. All right. So, the strongest part of our base is involved currently in relocations. Hopefully, we actually change that to generational wealth by the end of the year, with our 2026 goal being 100 new generational wealth families by the end of the year. But currently, the biggest tranche of our customer base is estate relocations. Um, Next is generational wealth, and neck with generational wealth are business acquisitions and mergers. So we have one of our lawyers that is dedicated to what's called corporate conveyance, which is all of the business law stuff. So there's one specific department, one head of that department that is dedicated specifically to corporate conveyance, mergers, acquisitions, and turnkey business. Then we have an estate planning lawyer who handles generational wealth and all of those things. And then we have our our immigration attorney that handles um, nothing but immigration. And all three of them have a small team of attorneys and, assistants, paralegals, so on and so forth underneath them. So it was brought to my attention that we very rarely speak about our mergers and acquisitions department and what that's all about, and are interested in acquiring, possibly merging with, or actively investing in businesses on the continent, and want to hear a little bit more about that. So We got enough of those emails where we said, okay, it makes sense for us to go ahead and we'll do that in the next live. And here we are. So, mergers, acquisitions, investing, turnkey. All right, what's the difference between all of them? Your easiest step is your passive investment, right? Which is typically called a limited partnership, right? Or a limited. So, a limited partner is what was colloquially called in the past a silent partner, right? A limited partner gives money, does not control the business in any way. That is a matter of law and it's pretty universal, right? And the reason why it's universal is because it has tax implications. So, tax stuff is where you see universality across business across the globe, right? Most things are not universal in the slightest, but things that affect how you're taxed are typically universal, all right, at least to a certain extent. And so this is one of those things. So limited partners are typically barred from having any kind of active control over the business. The reason for that is they're taxed at capital gains tax rates, okay, which is typically lower than active employment tax rates. So, why does that create an issue and create a universal kind of bar against your limited partners being able to actively work in the business? The reason why is because they would be taxed at corporate tax rate or at capital gains tax rates, which are lower than employment tax rates, which would mean that they would be actually engaging in tax evasion. So if they were actually managing the business but paying taxes as a limited partner, they would actually be paying less taxes because they're actively managing the business. Okay. So actively managing the business, people pay things like self-employment tax. They pay things like Social Security. They pay things like national health if there is a national health fund. Things like that are paid by employees and even self-employed. So even like the managing director, right, or the CEO or whatever you want to call the position, right? They all pay those taxes because they're part of the working economy. Investors don't pay those taxes because they're not part of the working economy. They're part of the capital, that engine that drives the working economy, right? So they're taxed differently. So it's typically illegal for anyone who is what we used to colloquially call back in the day a silent partner, and what is now typically legally called a limited partner. It's illegal for them to actively start working without changing their tax status. Okay, obviously they can say, you know what, I'm going to shift from a limited partner, to a general partner, which means that they're paying general taxes and they can actually work on things. But that shift has to be documented, and then taxes have to be paid appropriately, right? So that is the easiest way, typically, to invest beyond like brokerage style investing, like buying a stock off the stock market, right? The easiest way to directly invest is typically as a limited partner. Right now, um, the general partners, okay, the people who are running the business, so um, maybe the CEO, definitely the founder, but the people who are running the business with equity, the general partners, would decide what it costs to be a limited partner. Of course, you can negotiate, right? But they would be setting the price, and they would be the ones who would be open to negotiation at all, right? If they don't want to negotiate, they don't have to, right? So they would be the ones who set the price as far as limited partners coming into their company, buying equity, and creating that capital injection. They also have what's called a fiduciary responsibility, another thing that's essentially universal. Okay, if other people give you their money and they give you their money to operate a business, then you have a legal responsibility to their money, right? If they're now equity shareholders and they've given you their money and they're essentially silent partners, right? They're limited partners. So they have no say over the day-to-day operations of the business. They still get to vote in the annual meetings and all of that stuff, but they have no say over the day-to-day operations of the business. then you have a fiduciary responsibility to them. All right. So you have a responsibility to make them money and not lose them money. In a nutshell, that's what a fiduciary responsibility essentially is. All right. So that's the way that that really, really basic relationship works. It's also the basis for what a lot of people refer to as group economics. Group economics is, from a legal perspective, called syndication. Okay, you can syndicate anything, but the crux of that syndication is you have a team that is doing the work. Sometimes it's about licensing, right? So if you're syndicating a hospital, for example, only certain people can be medical administrators of that hospital. Only certain people, obviously, can be doctors in that hospital. They need licensing, they need degrees, they need certain things, right? So sometimes those compliance requirements that the law has set upon that particular industry will govern what type of people are on the general partnership team, and sometimes not, right? You can own an entire hospital and not serve any of those roles and hire all of those roles and those people not have equity, right? So sometimes you can get around people in the general team having those certifications depending on the industry. All right, it's a whole, because especially like things like nursing homes, right? Like we had set up a nursing home where no one on the general team had was a doctor, right? Had a physician's license and blah 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 blah. So no one on the general team had that. They just had this idea about nursing homes, and they had to hire the doctor. Well, when you do that, the doctor knows that he's necessary from a state level to sign off on many of the policies and procedures that are available in the nursing home, right? So without his signature, your business doesn't work. So his negotiations were aggressive because, if you didn't have him, you couldn't have the business legally, right? The business couldn't operate legally. So in those situations, you end up with these keyhole players, and these keyhole players can negotiate extraordinary salaries because without them, you can't do anything else, right? So that's kind of a deficiency when the general partners don't include that kind of keyhole player as maybe an equity stakeholder, or you don't just bring that person on to the general partnership. Same thing, we set up a pharmaceutical manufacturing company for clients in Sierra Leone. Same thing. You need a licensed pharmacist who's licensed under the pharmacy board in the country you're setting up the pharmaceutical manufacturing in, or else you legally can't do it. So that pharmacists can negotiate ridiculous rates of pay, even above and beyond the CEO, or else you can't open your doors anyway, right? So if you don't have that person already on the general partner team, then it's a weakness, right, in your structuring typically. Now, if it's a restaurant, or a hotel or something like that where you don't need any specialized anything, then you're fine. So it all depends on what you're syndicating, right? But what people colloquially refer to as group economics is actually called syndication. Okay, that's the actual legitimate way to do it. When you do it any other way, the number one concern becomes trust, because there is no recourse, there are no checks and balances, there's nothing assuaging people's distrust of the system. When you actually do a syndication, those players in the syndication are actually legally bound, right? There's a law that binds the fiduciary, who is the general partner, from the investor, who is the limited partner. There are set rules of what each one owes the other, right? And there are set precedences, and even in some places, special courts called chantry courts that specifically handle those situations, right? So you have precedent, you have case law, you have rules in place, you have all oversight, all of that stuff in place. Completely different than a couple guys in a barbershop talking about we're going to put our money together, right? So that's the difference. When you do your group economics the proper way, there's no trust issues whatsoever. All right, so there's that. So that's your easiest kind of way to invest in a company, is to be a limited partner. You throw money at it, they throw money at you, according to whatever schedule is agreed upon in the partnership agreement. So it might be you get money weekly, you might get money monthly, you might get money quarterly, you might get one big check annually. That's that's part of whatever syndication agreement is in place. Excuse me. And then there's an exit event. The exit event is where the big money is made. If you look at syndications, especially real estate syndications, they're typically three-figure returns or better, right? So your ROI is three digits or better, typically, right? Which is great, extraordinary investing. If you're an American, they restrict who's allowed to invest. So only the big dogs get to play uh, in the syndication game, right? But you can always go outside the United States and get something done. And there are special exemptions, but in general, you have to be a qualified investor in order to do them in the United States, or if you're a U.S. citizen, right? Um, this is part of the problem with most of the rules in the United States. Since the basis of the country is racism, most of the rules are racist, whether they even acknowledge it at this point or not, right? So in the United States, unfortunately, even if you have the money, it's very difficult for you to get involved in a syndication. It's even very difficult for you to find a syndication in the United States, because in the United States, the SEC says you're not allowed to advertise them. You can only talk to people who you already know about them. So you have to already have a business relationship with anybody who you. So literally, the law is set up to make it an old boys club. Literally, you have to already know the people. They already have to be millionaires because they have to be qualified investors. The millionaire status can't include their primary residence. So people who inherited mama's house don't qualify. So on and so on and so on. So America has all these little rules that stem from racism to keep certain people out, and they're still on the books. So it is what it is. We don't even deal in U.S. syndications at all. We engage in African syndications, right? So that's just us. You can do what you want. But that is how your syndications work in a nutshell, high level overview. Okay. The other side of that is turnkey opportunities. Turnkey opportunities are opportunities where you don't have to do a whole lot, right? So you may be the only equity holder, right? So you're not necessarily the limited partner. You might be the 100% equity stake, owner. You own it all, but you have somebody else set up everything, right? For us, this is primarily, we see it done in short-term and mid-term rentals, even sometimes long-term rentals, but short-term and mid-term primarily, right? So they'll have us build the house, hire the staff, create, whatever create whatever postings need to be created, whether it's Airbnb or VRBO or whatever the case may be. Sometimes it's a website, blah, 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 blah. And so they'll have, the turnkey operator create everything, hire everybody, create the systems, and then let that system work. And they can either, stay and be paid to manage the whole thing, or they can then kind of hand that system over to the owner. It's almost a franchise in the sense of the systems are set up for you. It's not a franchise in the sense you're not paying anybody for any royalties or rights or anything like that, and there's no franchising fees, right? So you get franchise service for your own personal business. That's essentially what turnkey is. Somebody comes in and sets up everything for you so that you can just turn the key and the car starts, all right? And the engine starts running. So that's what turnkey is, all right? When you don't have to do the work, it increases the price, right? It's just obvious, right? That if someone's setting it up for you, it makes it more expensive. But some people miss that. All right. So Turnkey setups are for people who typically are making so much money elsewhere that they don't have time to build the foundation of the business. That's typically how that works. And oddly enough, in the United States, those people are typically still not qualified investors, right? But but after one or two turnkey businesses, they will be. So um, I'm trying to think. We see a lot of like dental hygienists, a lot of dental hygienists actually, because they make over six figures. Still not so they're still not making like over a quarter million, which is like where they need to be a qualified investor. But they make over six figures, so they have a lot of disposable income. But they don't have a lot of time. Like they work really hard to make the six figures, right? So those are your people who are typically kind of in the sweet spot for like turnkey opportunities. Um, who else? Dentists as well. But besides doctors and lawyers, engineers, plumbers, not too many carpenters. Masons though, like bricklayers and stuff like that. Who else do we see a lot of? A lot of trades where electricians, ton of electricians. So people who make good money but they break their back for that money is essentially the people who are mostly invested in turnkey. They're also invested in syndication as well because that's also set it and forget it. But the people who want equity, they do want to own something. They're not just necessarily looking for an exit because that's the difference between syndication and turnkey. In syndication, there's an exit strategy from day one. You're looking for a big multiple exit at the end. So in syndication, it's like, okay, we'll set up an apartment building, fine, but in 5 years, we want to sell the apartment building for 10x what we, built it for. That's the syndication mindset. Other folks are like, no, 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 no. I just want to like own a business and ride that business to retirement, and retire in style or whatever the case may be. But I don't, even though I got the money, I don't have the time, right? I'm an engineer. I'm a UPS drivers. We used to get a lot of UPS drivers. Haven't many of them in the past, maybe 4 or 5 years. But UPS drivers, like seasoned UPS drivers, used to make a ton of money. So they would come in, 190,000 a year driving for UPS, and but they had no time, right? They part of that came from like overtime and stuff like that, and so they had no time, to go build an additional business, and so they would get turnkey. So if you're trying to think to yourself, well, like which one do I, make sense to me? Turnkey and syndication people on the limited partner side, right? So syndication people who are making capital gains, they're giving money and they're getting dividend checks back. That's it. Those folks are typically folks that make good money, but they bust their ass to make that good money, so they have limited time, right? So if you're working 60 hours a week, you're working, double shifts, and stuff like that on the weekends to make that money, then you're a good candidate for turnkey or to be a limited partner. General partners have to do the work. So think about it as like a hotel. Think about it as like you're getting into a hotel. The general partners are at the hotel working, right? They're the hotel manager, they're maybe the restaurant manager, they're in charge of housekeeping. Like they're physically at the hotel doing the work. That's what the general partners do. The limited partners gave all the money to get the hotel started. And every quarter or whatever, they get their percentage of the profits. The split, the standard split is 70-30. The limited partners have 70% equity, right? So they have 70% of the ownership. The general partners have 30% of the ownership. Okay. So the ones doing all the work have less than the ones who put up all the money because without the money, there'd be no work to do, right? That's the way that works. Turnkey is everything is set up for you and you don't really have to do anything. So you can take the money as though you're a limited partner and you would have like a manager installed and staff installed, and they all technically work for you, but you don't have to do any of the work. So it's almost like having a McDonald's franchise. Like you could go be the manager if you wanted to, which should increase your take home pay, right? Or you could hire a McDonald's manager and sit at home and then get what you get, right? So it's the same type of thing. And for most of the people who start their turnkey, that's exactly what they do. They have a manager there, they'll follow up on the quarterly reports or whatever. They'll have meetings with the bookkeeper, who's typically independent of the staff that's there, right? And make sure that everything is on the up and up, but they won't necessarily do the work because they have this other job that's making the money that allowed them to be a turnkey operator in the first place, right? So those two, features of investing are typically people who make good money, a lot of programmers, coders, and all of that stuff, but they do not have the time to actually build something from the ground up, or even to manage it. Like even if they could get it up off the ground and all that, managing it would cut into their primary gig essentially. All right, so that's turnkey and syndications. Now, mergers. Typically, if you're looking for a merger, not even typically, always, all of our merger clients are already in business. Okay, so you have two companies that are either parallelly integrated or vertically integrated, right? Um, or they have equipment that can be multi-purposed. So there's that, right? Like we did one merger where an olive oil company or an olive grove company and a wine company merged, because the natural stone press that they were using for the extra virgin olive oil, they wanted to use to not actually make wine, but to make another wine product called grappa. So they were expanding their wine business into this grappa product, and the olive oil business would be able to use certain fields, like they rotated the wine fields, right? So as the wine fields would rotate out, then the kind of mash, I think it was called the pulp mash, that wasn't used for anything could come in behind and like fertilize that field as they switched out. So their little, situation was that each side could benefit the other, and they had different machinery and different techniques and blah 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 blah. And I think regions mattered as well, because um, with European wines, the regions matter. Like if you're not from Champagne, then it's not Champagne, it's bubbly. And if you're not from this place, then it's not that, da 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 da, right? So also the region where the olive oil, or the olive grove was, would allow the winery to call certain products like a Bordeaux because that thing happened to be in Bordeaux, right? That type of thing. So those types of things sometimes push mergers as well. They're always going to be super, personal to the goals of both companies, obviously. And so it technically needs to be a win-win in order for it to be a merger. If it's not a win-win, then it's either an acquisition or a hostile takeover, one of the two, right? But typically for a merger, it needs to be a win-win. So merger clients typically already have a company, their company is already functioning, they already have their staff, they already have their systems, and now they're merging with another company. Okay. A temporary merger is called a joint venture, right? And so both companies merge in another vehicle. So with a joint venture, you typically create another company, and half of that company is owned by the one company that's involved in the joint venture, and the other half is owned by the other company that's involved in the joint venture. It doesn't have to be two companies. It can be four. It can be 10. It can be 100, right? It's typically two. And so there would be a new company formed, and that company would be jointly owned for the purpose of that venture, right? So you have a joint venture. So that's a temporary, it can be looked at as like a temporary merger. So rather than the two companies coming together forever. You just have this kind of temporary situation where they're working together for this one thing. So that's how that part works. All right. So you have your limited partners in your syndications, excuse me, making mailbox money. Then you have your two companies coming together in your merger. You have your turnkey operator who's essentially having everything set up for them, and then they'll run it into perpetuity. All right. And now you have your joint venture, right? So the last one is your acquisition. Okay. The acquisition is you buying a company, right? You're going to acquire that company at a multiple, typically of cash flow, right? A standard multiple is probably 3x, right? So a 3x multiple of cash flow. Now, there's some things that you got to look at. You got to make sure that like people will take their salary out of the company, and then you'll be looking at it and maybe possibly classifying it as a bill, right? You need to get those classifications right to figure out what your real multiple is, right? So there's little things that you got to look at like that. You got to look at any depreciation that's going on in the business. It's not just a clear cut. What's your cash flow times three? That's a standard. It's not that clear cut. There's still more of a formula involved to make sure that there aren't factors diminishing the cash flow. And then depending on how you acquire the property or the business, you may have to factor in financing because a lot of people will finance an acquisition. So then that cash flow might get cut in half, maybe even more than half right off the bat because of financing, right? So we've seen acquisitions where the cash flow was like $400,000 a year pre-acquisition, and then they financed the acquisition. So now the cash flow was like less than 200,000 a year, right? So then they got to figure out whether or not they can make everything work on half the cash flow because they have this financing loan hanging over their head that needs to be paid off, right? A lot of times, the beauty of coming out here is that most of the things that you would have needed financing for, in the West, wherever, you don't need financing for, in Kenya specifically. And so a lot of folks that would finance acquisitions in America outright buy it. So they maintain the cash flow. So that's the bonus to them is that they maintain the higher cash flow. And especially if they can see a way to deploy technology and instantaneously increase cash flow or even just deploy market familiarity. That happens all the time, right? So there'll be times where as a US person, they can access the US market. And so instantaneously upon acquisition, they're adding 30, 40, 50% to the cash flow because they have instantaneous access to a foreign market, right? And they can engage that market as a local. And so that happens all the time where, it might be a business that's not crushing it over here because they only have access to the local market. And then two things happen. Foreign businesses are looked almost as like luxury imports. So you revitalize the local market all of a sudden because now all of a sudden it's, it's an American brand or it's a British brand or whatever. And that's just local market psychology. It's just the way they feel about it. And you gain access back to your home market, right? So both sides end up, increasing. So we've seen it where like the cash flow doubles, just because the new owners have taken over. So you just have to have your strategy on right. So that's it. Those are the categories. All right. That's what you guys asked for. Those are the categories and how they work. Took us about 30 minutes to get through the categories. Do you guys have any questions on any of that? What was the tax classification difference between? Okay, I'll wait for you to finish. I guess you ran out of characters there. A limited partner and general partner. Yeah, okay. So a general partner is working. They're an employee, even if they're running the place. Like even if they're the CEO, they're still an employee, right? So a general partner is working. All right, they're working the investment. They're the ones building the money for everybody. General partners also have unlimited liability, right? Limited partners have limited liability. So limited partners are safe. General partners have unlimited liability. Way to fix that, but we won't get into that this live. So general partners have unlimited liability, so they're not safe from lawsuits, and they're doing the physical work. So they're paying self-employment tax or, you know, income tax, social security, national health fund, if such a thing exists, you know, all of that stuff they're paying because they're working on the ground. Limited partners are only paying capital gains tax or whatever other local thing might be, you know, available to them. But they're typically only paying capital gains tax, which is typically a lower tax rate. So if you're double dipping, then you're paying the capital gains tax, but you're not paying like your self-employment tax, so it's like a tax evasion. That's why limited partners are typically legally not allowed to work. They're only allowed to receive passive income. What's going on, Kristen? Right? So that's the tax distinction. You can jump from an LP to a GP, but it just has to be really, really well documented so that the taxes can be paid right. Because that's probably the number one issue that the government's going to take with it. Number one issue the government's going to take with it is, oh, are you, you know, for example, you might be paying 14% capital gains tax, where if you were working, it would be like, I don't know, 37%, right, in income tax, right? So that's where they look at it like, oh, you're just saying that you're a limited partner when you're actually a general partner. Why would you do that? Oh, you would do that to defraud us of taxes, right? So that's typically why there's that anathema on limited partners working. All right, exactly. Yep, that's it. That's it. What were you saying about the qualifications for turnkey being the same as the? Well, so the way you worded that makes me think you're an American. Um, so if you're talking about the American SEC, which is a different animal, and you're talking about being a qualified investor to be able to join a syndication, those qualifications are not the same, right? So if you're specifically talking about the American SEC and having to be a qualified investor to even be part of a syndication, you would not have to be a qualified investor to be a turnkey operator, right? Because it's just owning a business. So that's different. And the way you worded that was kind of weird. So I'm thinking you're talking about that. But as far as the types of clients who are interested in both limited partnership, being an LP in a syndication, and being a turnkey operator, right? Having a business that was set up by turnkey are the same type of people. So they're the type of people that have a lot of money because they work crazy hours to make that money. So they don't have a lot of time. They've traded a significant amount of time for money, and they know that inflation is kicking their ass. Like the money that they got sitting in the bank and all of that is being eaten away by inflation. So they're literally losing money while they work. They're smart enough to know that, right? But they can't stop working and go open up a business because they have family, they have whatever, but they got money. So what they'll do is they'll pay that money into either a syndication, or they'll pay a turnkey host to create a turnkey opportunity for them, but that they completely own. So what the turnkey person does is they almost act the same way that a franchise acts, right? So like if you get a McDonald's franchise, corporate sends out a bunch of people. They send you, you know, a bunch of software for the registers and all of that. They send you out maybe a bunch of marketing stuff and all of that, so that you have the advertisements, you have the software, your people are trained by their like corporate high startup team and all of that stuff, right? You don't really have to do very much, you know, once you buy into you know, the franchise. You just have to have your management team, and that doesn't have to be you, right? Same type of thing with Turnkey, except it's not a franchise. You own it all. So with Turnkey, you're just paying somebody to set up the business because you don't have time to do it. Hire all the people, create all the systems, create all the software if that's necessary, create all the advertisements, get all the marketing together, right? And so you're paying more, right? A lot of like entrepreneurs would bootstrap that. Turnkey does not make you an entrepreneur, because the people who are interested in turnkey have the money to do it, right? So by definition, to be an entrepreneur, you have to have an extraordinary financial risk in the business endeavor, right? So if the business goes on there, you're homeless, right? You have some extraordinary financial risk in that business endeavor. If you have the money to turnkey, you don't have an extraordinary risk. If you lose the money, you lose the money. It doesn't matter. You keep it moving. You're not automatically homeless or something like that. You're a business owner. There's a difference, right, between being just a business owner or being an entrepreneur. Complete difference, right? So if losing the business doesn't destroy you financially, you're not an entrepreneur. You're a business owner. Nothing wrong with that. But just so you know, when you're telling people what you are, especially if you're telling people who may become partners or invest or whatever, they know the difference, right? They're not using the words colloquially. They're not using layman's terms and just calling anybody who owns a business an entrepreneur, right? They know what an entrepreneur is from what a business owner is, right? So if they hear you say you're an entrepreneur and then when you describe your situation, you're actually a business owner, you lose clout, especially with somebody who's going to invest money in you, right? So if you're not using the proper terminology with the people that you're asking money from, you're going to have a problem, right? So know the difference. Even though, you know, the TikTok gurus are going to act like the words are interchangeable, they're not when it comes to people who are actually giving you their money and expecting a return. They expect you to know what you're talking about, right? So typically, those are business owners. Same thing with limited partners. You're not investing more money than you have. You know what I mean, in a group economics situation, right? So you're putting the money in that you can afford to lose. So you're in that you know aspect, you're just a straight up investor, quite frankly, right? But when you do the turnkey, you're typically a business owner. You're not an entrepreneur typically, right? Same thing with a merger. It's the company is doing the merging. Now the owner of that company could be an entrepreneur. That's possible, but it's the company that's merging, right? The company is a distinct entity, and it's doing the merging. Now with the acquisition, you could be an individual executing an acquisition of a company, and as the individual, what you're putting up to finance the acquisition could categorize you as an entrepreneur. So if that bet doesn't pay off, it could ruin you. That could be the end of you. Now you're an entrepreneur, right? So it just depends on, you know, on who you really are, and then moving forward from there. Yeah, so those two folks, the LP folks and the turnkey folks, to have enough disposable income to afford it. That's it. They just don't have the time to run it, typically. Right, when they're individuals. There are funds. So your LP can have what's called institutional LPs. Institutional LPs are different than LPs. So like an institutional LP can be a bank. It can be a venture capitalist fund. It can be a private equity fund. Institutional LPs are entities. So that's different. They're they're making the syndication part of their portfolio. That's a different situation. As what, as a startup? Yeah, well, that's a different situation entirely, right? So for startups, and we do deal with some startup people, but not from that angle. Most startups are bootstrapped until they get funding, right? That's essentially how. So they're bootstrapped, new businesses. They try to gain traction. Typically, they scale instead of grow. So rarely are they like product businesses, because product businesses, it's almost impossible for them to scale. They typically grow. And so VCs are typically looking for scaling, not growing. And then once you have traction, you can start asking for money. All right. Um, for our interactions, we're typically dealing with startup founders who make good money. Maybe they make that money remotely, or maybe they have gotten a little bit of financing. So now they're making their money from the company, but it's not a lot, right? So they haven't gotten like some, $1 million round yet or anything like that. So it's still not a crap ton of money. And whatever they're doing is probably tech or software related, so they can do it from anywhere. And so what they'll do is they'll either get a digital nomad permit through us, or they'll get a residency permit through us, and they'll move here where they could, effectively live off of $500, $600 a month, right? So now they have more money to bootstrap into the startup. So that's as far as startup engagement, with us. That's primarily how we interact with startup people. It's not too many people calling us to create a startup for them. Um, and you typically wouldn't do that with like a turnkey type of situation, right? Like a startup might purchase your turnkey business, but you typically wouldn't do that with a turnkey situation. I suppose you could, but not something that I see very often. Why wouldn't you? Because in startups, cash is everything. To do a turnkey, you're going to pay double, maybe even more, what it costs to build that business, because you have to pay someone to build every single aspect of it for you. And you're not just paying them. Like, yes, maybe you are only paying that one person, but they're paying an advertising agency. They're paying maybe a construction firm if they have to build something. Like if it's an Airbnb turnkey, you got to build the Airbnb, right? So, maybe they're paying the general contractors to build the Airbnb for you, all of that stuff. They're paying the bookkeeper to keep the books, and then they're paying the CPA to file the taxes at the end of the year. So, like, even though you're maybe paying one person, that one person isn't putting the money in their pocket. They're paying five, six, seven other people, and then once everything is up and running, they're hiring your entire staff. So if you have a check-in staff, if you have a maid service, if you have a laundry service, if you got any of that stuff, all of that stuff is also covered in whatever you're paying your turnkey operator. So the price that it would have cost you if you did all the stuff, like if you stayed at the property and you cleaned up after every guest and you did the maid stuff, and if they wanted laundry, you took it to your house and washed it yourself. Like if you bootstrapped that thing and you did everything yourself, it would probably cost in currency 50%, maybe even less, for you to do it yourself. But currency is not your issue if you're looking at turnkey. Time is, right? You got the money, you just don't got the time. Those are the people who look at turnkey. So they pay more to have somebody else who has the time do everything for them, right? So if you're going to do a startup, and capital is the most intensive aspect of any startup, spending double the capital to get the startup going doesn't make any sense. And investors are going to see it the exact same way. So while, yes, you could do it, it doesn't make any sense to do it, which is why we don't engage in startups in that way. That's typically a mindset shift that you actually want to make, because a lot of people ask could questions that should be should questions, right? Can I do this? The real question is, should you do that? Not can you do that, right? And so definitely start training your mindset to reframe questions, because can spiral down into just mental masturbation, where it's just, oh, I want to think this thing through and feel good that I thought it through, and never do anything about it, right? So can just spiral you into anywhere. Should is going to essentially end at a you should do this or you shouldn't do this next situation, instead of well, can I do this? Well, can I do that? Can I do this? Well, can I do that? And then you're just dreaming and not doing anything, right? So just work on reframing how you look at the questions for efficiency, right? Trust me, it'll help. It took me way too many years to figure that out. How do you figure out the multiple on the, hold on, this device is in the way. I can't read what you said. How do you figure out the multiple on the acquisition? Okay. There's multiple different formulas. The one that people talk about all the time is EBITDA. But essentially, you want to look, well, your goals matter as well. Most people want to look at the cash flow, right? If you have a different goal in mind for the acquisition, there are other metrics that you might want to look at. But most people, they want to look at the cash flow, and then they want to like remove, all of the bills, the taxes, typically the owner's salary. They want to remove all of those things, and try to get a net operating, income, and really see like what's going on in the company. Everything else is stripped away, and then work a multiple from there. So it might be three times, what the company makes a year, as the multiple at which they're willing to buy the company. And then people might come back and be like, no, I want 10 times, this is a great company. I want 10x, da 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 da. And then you negotiate in there, right? Plenty of deals, just there's plenty of deals that you just walk away from, because there's plenty of babies being sold out there, right? And people don't sell their baby cheap. That person already has the wrong idea about business, period. If they're acting like a business is their child, then you typically just want to walk away from that deal, period, right? Real business people understand exactly what a business is. They know it's not their child. They know it's an income driving vehicle and an asset producing vehicle, and that's it. And it has, a fair market value, and you operate from that position, right? Those are the deals that make sense to proceed with, because anyone treating it like it's their baby has probably screwed up all of the numbers, and like all of those numbers are fake, right? And they don't even know it. Like they're not trying to like screw over or like commit fraud or something, but it's their baby, right? So what do you do when your baby's sick, right? You take off work, you stay home, and you nurse your baby back to health, right? So what do you do when the cash flow in the business is sick? You take your own money out of the bank and you inject it into the business, and because it's your baby, right? You're not treating it like a real business, right? So those people have jacked up the numbers guaranteed. They've added their own, padding. They've given money to their baby to keep their baby alive, and that's why they overvalue it, which is probably not as good a business at all, right? Real business people will let a business die because it doesn't deserve to live. And if it can't, make enough money to support itself, it doesn't deserve to exist. They're not going to sit there and inject it, you know, unless their strategy is something different, right? If their strategy is, all right, we're not going to make money for the first 10 years, which doesn't actually mean that you don't make money. It means that you take the money you make and reinvest it in the company so you don't post a profit. That's what that means, right? So when people talk about like, oh, well, Facebook didn't make money for a decade, you think those people were volunteering their time at Facebook? Think Mark Zuckerberg was volunteering his time at Facebook and the time they didn't get paid? No, they didn't post a profit, right? The company didn't make money. That's a different thing, right? But if not even making enough money to reinvest, that's different. That's different than not posting a profit, right? Your company is losing. Not that it's posting a loss because it reinvested, right? It's losing, and then it doesn't deserve to exist. So real people who are running real businesses, they're not going to keep their baby alive. They're going to let businesses that don't deserve to exist die. And so when you run across those people who are talking to you about their baby, you want to walk away from that acquisition as quickly as possible. Because it's probably going to take a forensic accountant to even find all the bullshit that they've injected into that business. So we always recommend you only do acquisitions with real business people. That would not be the time to get delusional or to feed delusion. Because you inherit everything. You inherit the bullshit of the business. You inherit all the great things in the business. You inherit everything. Yep, the current debts, all of that. Now, those things do need to be disclosed, right? So it's kind of like buying a house. If there's a hole in the roof, you're supposed to tell, and if you don't tell, there's recourse, right? So it's not like you're buying a business and they have a $1 billion loan and you didn't know about it, right? But you inherit all of that, and if those decisions were made on emotion because it's their baby and not on some strategic, business plan, then you don't want it. And a lot of people will do that. A lot of people will do that, and like, because what they have is a job, not a business. So they bought themselves a job, and they'll actually work that job into retirement, and then want to sell the job to you so that they can retire. And they got this number in their head that they're going to sell the job for, and to hold them over through retirement until they die, and it's not worth that. It's only worth that to them in their head. That's why you have so many small businesses that the kids don't take it, because the kids resent the business. Because most of the time, the people who think about the business in that way have financially neglected their kids for the business, and the kids have noticed. So they don't want the business, and that's it. When the person dies, business dies, and that's the end of it. So you see the statistics about how many businesses are going to die, they're available. But part of the statistic that's not, spoken on is how many of those businesses are garbage businesses, just garbage jobs that one person owns, that they're keeping afloat on their personality. You know, they've been alive long enough in that community that certain people just call them because whether or not they're the best, and that's it. And when they go, ain't nobody finna call their son off the memory of them. You know what I mean? So the children are right to not take on the business. What about a laundromat? What about a laundromat? Can you acquire? Yeah, you can acquire a mat. You can merge with the laundromat. You can do a joint venture and create a laundromat. You can syndicate a laundromat, but if you syndicate it, it would typically be multiple laundromats. But you could syndicate a laundromat, and be the LP in the syndication if you wanted, and all of that stuff. So yeah, you can do most of the things with most of the businesses. You could do it. It's just the way you decide to engage in business. Can you turnkey it? Yeah, yeah, you can turnkey a laundromat. Sure, we've actually done that a couple times. You can turnkey a laundromat. Typically, with that, what you're doing is you want the laundromat to be automated to a certain extent, right? But you can charge a premium if you still have a human element there, um, providing convenience to customers, right? And so you want to automate it as much as possible, sure, but at the same time, you can charge a premium if you'll come to someone's house and pick up the laundry and then bring it to the laundromat, have your staff, wash it and then fold it and then put it in a bag and vacuum out the air so it's this, you know, hard, freeze dried bag basically type of thing. And then send back these perfectly uniform little cubes, that the air has been sucked out of for the all this permanent pressed laundry, that the person ordered and deliver it directly to their house. You can charge a premium for that, right? So for people coming in, the automation is nice because then you can run 24/7. So they buy a card, they have to put so much money on the card when they buy it, right? That card, they can swipe the card. It lets them in at 3 in the morning if that's when they want to do their laundry, right? But you don't have a bunch of crazy people in the laundromat because they don't have a card, right? And people can come in and automate, and do their laundry off the card. They don't have to worry about being robbed because you got a card and blah 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 blah. So the automation helps. But then from the turnkey side of it, if you're looking to charge a premium, then you need individuals providing premium services. Hey, Whale, how are you? Do you help with businesses so one can transition to Africa? Who's the one? Do I help with businesses so one business can transition to Africa, or is the one like the people? So like a person can transition to Africa? And the answer to both are yes. I'm not sure where to go with the conversation, but we have so a person can. Yeah, sure. So sometimes people buy businesses here so that they can, come here as a business owner. Sometimes they have a business and they bring that business here. Um, Sometimes people come here and end up illegally operating a business because they don't know any better, and then it works out really, really bad for them. So, yeah, definitely you can do that. There's a couple ways to do it. Like I said, you can buy a business that's already operating, and then figure out like what the cash flow of that business is, and what it's going to take to operate that business, and so on and so forth. So that would be an acquisition. If you have a business, you can, essentially buy a stake in another business, which could be a merger, right? Depending on how you set that up. So you could come in and be a minority merger or a majority merger, and so on and so forth. So a lot of times when people are looking at that, they have some like retail side business that they would benefit from owning the supply chain. So if you owned like a t-shirt shop in Philly, and so you're buying your T-shirts from Glidden and Fruit of the Loom and whoever, and then you're printing Black Lives Matter on them or something. I don't know, right? And then from there you're selling these T-shirts, right? So the issue becomes, and you see this a lot with like black-owned like shirt businesses and stuff like that. You'll see that like their T-shirts are like $40, $50, and you're like, holy hell, why is it so expensive? It's because they don't control their supply chain, right? So by the time they're done with the ink and the printing and the purchasing of the shirt and the da, 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 and then they get to the retail, it really is $45, $50, right? And then people are like, I'll just go to Walmart, right? So those people tend to benefit from actually owning their supply chain. So if they can purchase a t-shirt manufacturer in Kenya, which would essentially be them purchasing the supply chain for pennies on the dollar. Then all of a sudden, now they're making their own shirts to their own quality specifications, here, and then importing them, and because of AGOA, you used to be able to import them tariff free and tax free, right? Because it was a handmade, or you could produce it as a handmade, African product, which would get it tax exemption. So you'd be able to bring it in tariff free, and then do your printing on it, and now you can sell it for 19.99 and still make a 50% margin, right? So those are the people who typically, it makes sense for them to do some sort of merger. So it all depends on the strategic planning. It just depends on who you are, what you want to do, what the business is. But it's definitely possible. You just have to have a team that knows enough to be able to strategically plan it out with you so that you do whatever is best for you. Good to see you, Mr. Whale. How are you doing? I'm good. I'm good, Edith. How are you? I'm in healthcare, but looking to have income on the continent. I have a few properties in the U.S. Try to put in a trust. You're trying to put in a trust, or you tried to put it in a trust? Um, you can definitely maintain properties anywhere in the world, So, we typically don't recommend selling the properties because there's so many ways to just pull money out of them. Um, so it seems like you're doing all right on that front. Uh, Trying to structure it in a trust. Okay. Okay. Definitely work with a professional who knows what they're doing. Properties are tricky, right? Properties are tricky because, number one, so I'll give you an example. I'll give you a real world example. We had a client that came to us with property in Berks County, Pennsylvania, and they put that property in a trust. And so they came to us with the property already in the trust. Okay, fine. In Berks County, Pennsylvania, it snows. There's a local ordinance in the city, maybe not the county, but it might have been a city ordinance in the city that she was in the county. So they had a local ordinance that when it snows, you have, I think it was 24 hours to remove the snow from your steps for mailmen and from the sidewalk. Now, mind you, you don't own the sidewalk. Like, you can't tell somebody, get off my sidewalk, right? But in this ordinance, the sidewalk was covered under your homeowner's insurance, right? Which obviously affected the premiums of homeowners insurance in this city. That was the law. So this person had moved. They put their home in a trust, okay, like you're talking about. So they put their home in the trust and they had moved, and then a snow happened while they weren't even living in the country. Okay, after that snow happened, someone slipped on the sidewalk and fell. That went against their homeowner's insurance. Their homeowner's insurance couldn't cover the entire claim. So then it went to the owner of the house. The owner of the house was the trust. So that person was literally able to eliminate their entire generational what they were trying to save for their children because they did the trust themselves, or they didn't have a professional to tell them that the trust shouldn't own the house directly, right? The trust should have owned the company that owned the house, and the company would have been broke, and then they could have went after the company all they want and got a broke company, and that would have been the end of that. But that's not what happened to them because they didn't know what they were doing, and they thought ChatGPT could make a trust for them. So just make sure, and we don't do local trusts, so I'm not like selling myself. We do offshore trusts, right? So just make sure that that local trust that you're dealing with, you have a local professional who not only knows federal trust, statutes, but also understands any local laws that might be at play, city, county, and state, to make sure that the way you design your structure protects you and insulates you from all of those things. So just be careful with that. There's a lot of people on the interwebs telling you just throw stuff into a trust that don't belong into a trust. We've had people who, followed some, talker on the internet and put their car in a trust. I seen this big millions of views. I seen this thing pop up. The guy talking about this is my trust structure. This is how I do it. My cars and my family trust. My cars and my house. The first thing he said, and millions of views on this video. What happens if you get in a car accident? Who's the owner of the car? The trust. What happens if that car unalive somebody in that accident? It's your fault. It's your negligence. Now you owe millions and millions of dollars, and the vehicle that was supposed to protect your family's generational wealth just went right out the window because you listened to some idiot on TikTok who said to put your cars in a trust. Right? So just be sure that you're using a professional. Do not try to save money on a trust. If you need to save money, then you can't afford a trust. If you're creating a trust and you're trying to save, you're trying to penny pinch and trying to go to ChatGPT, you can't afford a trust. Right? Make sure a professional is creating that trust for you. Can a U.S. business be in an offshore trust if instructed it that way? No, it's okay. It's okay. I assume that you're talking to the phone. It's all good. I'm dyslexic myself, so I'm not one of those. Can a U.S. business be in an offshore trust? Yes. If you structure it that way, yes. Yes, it can. Can a U.S. property be in an offshore trust? Yes, but we never recommend it. And here's why. Because the trust is offshore, you can still kind of like structure it and make sure that even if somebody in that scenario, if that happened and they fell, they broke their leg, blah, 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 they still couldn't get to the trust. Like the court would order that the trust pay, but like the offshore trust don't actually have to pay. And, that's a different, live for a different day. But the problem is that the real property is in the local court's jurisdiction. So here's what we've seen in the almost two decades that we've been doing this. There are things that may technically be legal, but they're procedurally illegal. They're administratively illegal, right? And so in order to undo that thing, you have to go to court and show that, this thing happened out of order. And so a judge can get annoyed, like a local judge especially, can get annoyed by the fact that they can't get through this trust. And they can just illegally seize the property because it's in their jurisdiction. And you can be like, well, you can't. Well, that's short. Send the property owner in, and then we'll release the property to the property owner because, we can't do that, but we did. So send the property owner in, have them sue us, and send the property owner in, and we'll release the property to the property owner. Well, if the trustee actually does fly in, now the trustee is in jurisdiction, and they can compel the trustee to comply with their orders, right? So when it's physical property, typically, we typically advise people to put that into a limited liability structure of some sort, whether it's an LLC. In the United States, that's typically what it is. Maybe it's an LLP if you want it to be like a family limited liability partnership where like all of the family members have an equity share or whatever. I guess you could do that. But some structure that has limited liability protection, and then that structure can be owned by any trust, whether it's offshore or domestic or whatever. You obviously have way more protection in an offshore trust. That's the whole point of an offshore trust, is so that the offshore judge can flip the bird to the local judge, right? So the whole point of an offshore trust from the protection standpoint is that when something happens to you locally, if you structured the trust properly, then no matter what the local judge orders, you could comply with the local judge's orders, and the trustee will still just say "F you," right? In terms, right? So that's essentially the power of an offshore trust. But you got to choose the right, location offshore, because there are some countries that will acquiesce to a U.S. judgment. There are other countries that are like, we don't give a damn what the U.S. court said. That's not here. And they won't even let you register the judgment in that country unless you have standing, which you don't. Because in order to have standing, then an infraction would have had to happen in that country, right? So that's the whole point of offshore. Right. So yeah, I mean, you can definitely do it. Trust services, not so much. For trust services, our primary trust, the one that most of our clients go for, is a generational wealth style trust. But we have clients that need asset protection, right? They're trying to protect their assets. Again, not necessarily their properties, right? But their assets beyond real assets, right? So you got a bunch of real estate. Okay, cool. Equity strip all of them, right? Equity strip all the real estate except maybe your primary residence or whatever. Take now the liquid cash and invest it, right? And now you have investment assets. Now you have stocks, now you have bonds, now you have all of that stuff. The issue is that people forget they're the weak link in limited liability. So yeah, your company might have limited liability, but you don't. So again, back to the car accident. You get into the car accident. The medical, it's your fault. The medical bills are way more than your policy covers, and you don't have an umbrella policy to cover the rest, right? So now they say, okay, what do you got? And you're like, all right, well, I wasn't in the company car. I wasn't acting as my LLC. My LLC got limited liability. That's great. Guess who owns the stock of the LLC? What's called a membership unit if it's an LLC and not a corporation. Who owns the membership units? Who doesn't have limited liability? So if you ain't got the money to pay, whose membership units get turned over? Now they own your LLC because you're the weak link, right? This is the stuff that the internet gurus don't talk about, right? So in order to remove yourself as the weak link, that's when people throw their shares in asset protection trusts offshore, right? So now I don't own the shares, right? But I might still be the person who votes because I might be the proxy voter for the shareholder, right? So maybe I'm voting even if I'm not the trustee. I don't have to be the trustee to be the proxy voter, right? The proxy voter is somebody who's simply put up by the owner, right? So you might be the one who votes on anything to do with those shares as the proxy, but you don't own them. So you're no longer the weak link, right? So it's, little things like that. So now all the equity is stripped out. All the equity is in the trust. The trust is making investments. In the best case scenario, the trust has what's called a family office. All right. So the trust is making investments through the family office. Anything that happens on the actual properties, the properties are broke, number one. So somebody sues the properties. There's not even any equity in the property to be had. And they're in a second or third position because you have a primary, lien holder on the property. That's how you equity stripped it. So the first position is the bank. Now the bank might be you, but that's a discussion for another life. Right? But whoever the lien holder is in the first position. Might be a secondary lien, a secondary mortgage, right? Whoever they're in the second position. That's why it's called a second mortgage. So now the person who's coming trying to sue or whatever, they're now in the third position, right? So definitely ain't no lawyer taking that on consignment. When the lawyer does a due diligence and says, all right, well, you don't have to pay me until we win. We definitely going to win this case. But then they look, oh, there's already two mortgages on this, and that's all the nah, this one's not for me. Sorry, you got to find somebody else, right? So it immediately dissuades, frivolous, lawsuits and frivolous legal engagement because can't nobody get nothing, and the lawyer is going to check, especially a lawyer that's working on consignment, like a lawyer who doesn't get paid until after they win. They're going to check to make sure that they can get some money out of this. And if not, they're just going to be like, no, this is not something that we want to get involved in. So the real estate typically is leveraged to get into more powerful investments, syndications. Over here in Kenya currently, we have a whole bunch of 20 ROI special funds, 20% ROI special funds, net, mind you, not gross, net. And we have serious bonds that are available right now that are paying out 14%, 15%, on something as safe as a government bond. So a lot of our trusts out here are just investing in those kinds of things, and they're making double the S&P 500 per year, and they're 20% ROI on their special funds. If you want to look them up, the ones that are most popular out here are Mansa X special fund. Obviously, we don't own them, and who else? Oak Special Fund. Again, obviously we do not own them. They're investment banks, but they're doing good. They're paying out like 22%, 20% to their investors right now. And yeah, the Kenyan bonds are paying. We just did the last two bonds we did. One was 12%, the other one was 14. That was 25 years. Those guys are going to get 12% and 14% guaranteed by the government for the next 25 years. So, you know, there are better ways to treat your money than to have it wrapped up in real estate per se, especially if you're leaving though. It's harder when you're staying. It's easier when you're leaving because if everything goes upside down, it's bankruptcy. Who cares? You don't live there. Your credit report does not follow you around the world, right? So you already got the money out, like you know what I mean. You already got that money working in other things and all of that. So it's way safer to go ahead and execute those types of plays when you no longer live in the country, right? Especially if, most of our clients, they get a secondary citizenship here. So their passport portfolio starts with whatever bloodline passport they might be unaware that they even qualify for. And then the next one is typically their trust location. So they'll get a passport here after 7 years. So it's not a fast passport. They'll get a passport here after 7 years, and then in their passport portfolio plan, whatever passports make the most sense for them, will already be working on in that time. So most people will get about three passports per generation. There are aggressive passport portfolios where they're getting, seven or eight per generation, but that also requires a substantial amount of funds. So yeah, that's how those things play out. How much do you need to have a family office? There's no minimum per se. Obviously, the family has to be working, so you have to be able to pay the fees of whoever you're going to hire at the family office. But really, the family office is just a private brokerage. That's it. So by the time you get to a family office, you're already investing, so you're already paying brokerage fees. So the kind of the number one way to look at it is, are my family office fees the same as my brokerage fees? And when you get to a yes, then it might make sense to just go ahead and do the family office. Because depending on the fees you pay into the family office might be deductible. So you might tax benefit somewhere else for those fees where you wouldn't necessarily get them from JP Morgan. You know what I mean? So if you're already paying brokerage fees, and the brokerage fees you're paying are equivalent to what you would pay your private broker to handle that for you, then you can afford a family office at that point. Yeah, definitely. If you want to go over and like review some stuff that you already have, that's in legalese, and all of that, then you'll see when you try to book a consultation with me, there's only going to be like two options. So when you do that, just pick the legal option, and then there'll be a lawyer guaranteed in that consultation, and they can review everything and give an actual legal opinion right then and there. Don't do an initial consultation because there's a lawyer in an initial consultation. Just do a legal consultation. There'll be a lawyer there. It's longer also, so you'll have you'll be able to send those things in advance. So the lawyer will look over everything before the consultation and like already have their notes ready and all of that. So make sure you do that as well. Yeah, you're most welcome. You're most welcome. Actually, we ended up leaving the United States because there was so much nonsense at the higher levels of investing. And so the SEC regulations on who is and isn't a qualified investor, we just think that's based in racism, quite frankly, um, which a lot of things are, right? Like the credit system in the U.S. was was based in racism, right? You go back and you check the actual history of it. It was invented previously, but it wasn't in wide use until what do they call them? The covenants had gotten knocked down. The covenants that said that black people weren't allowed to own like property, and so now black people can move into any neighborhood they wanted, and integration hit and all of that. And now all of a sudden you needed a credit score to move into that neighborhood. Like so, that's how everything is. Like the history of America is just done that way, and it was just ridiculous that you could be a millionaire, but because your million net worth included your primary residence, it didn't count, right? You can make $150,000 a year, and that still wouldn't be enough to qualify you as a qualified investor, even if your burn rate, your annual burn rate was 50,000, right? Like if you lived below your means and you were only spending 50,000 a year, you made 150,000 a year, which means that you saved $100,000 a year. You didn't qualify as a qualified investor. Go look it up. You didn't qualify, right? Now there are loophole ways around it, and to Obama's credit, he during the Jobs Act, he did set up something called a sophisticated investor, but those are limited, right? So the types of investment declarations or Reg D investments and stuff like that, the type of regulations that your investment is operating under, the ones that allow the sophisticated investors, they're capped. They can only have so many. But then there's other things like you can't discuss an investment with somebody that you don't have a prior relationship with, right? So literally, the law makes it a good old boys club, right? That's why a lot of people were attending Stanford and dropping out because all of the VCs, all of the early big VCs, originated in Stanford. So you could go to Stanford, drop out, but then say, "Oh, I have a prior relationship with this fund manager because we're both alumni of Stanford," right? And so, things of that nature. So it's set up to be that way, and we were just like, forget it, forget it, forget it. We'll go to Africa, where everything is set up based on sense, not racism, and all the rules make sense here, and we'll just operate within the rules that make sense and call it a day. So there's other ways to do it. You can get licensed. There's like a like license exemption where you're like qualified investor by license. And then you might not even, because the argument is, oh, well, the qualifications are to make sure that if you have the money, you got to have the money, right? So you got to be multi-millionaire. Da, 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 da. Okay, cool. So I don't have any money, but I got a Series 7 license, right? I went to school, whatever, whatever. I took the test. I passed the test. I got a Series 7 license, and my net worth is negative $30,000 because I owe money, student loans on the MBA that I just got, you know, before I came and got this Series 7 license. So I got no money. I'm a qualified investor because I have a Series 7 license. Right. So the loopholes are designed so that, okay, I'm Bill Gates. I have a net worth of, $40 billion, but that ain't my son's net worth. That's my net worth. So how do I get my son to become a fund manager and leverage my name, to make money by hosting these funds? Oh, okay, he can just get a Series 7 license. I can just pay his way through, or a Series 66 license or whatever. I can just pay his way and get him licensed. And then without him having any net worth at all, magically, he's a qualified investor. But the nurse who's an RN who lives just outside the hood, who makes $120,000 a year, but her burn rate is $60,000 a year, right? Or who makes $200,000 a year because she's a travel nurse, but because she's a travel nurse, she has very little living expenses because that's all covered in her per diem, right? So she's making $200,000 a year and she's keeping $150,000 a year. She doesn't qualify, right? You see how stupid it is. So we were just like, look, all right, it's obvious what this is, right? Same thing that everything in America is. It's based on institutional racism. We're going to go somewhere where the institutional racism doesn't exist. And so that was a big, big, big part of us leaving the U.S. I appreciate that. All right. Any other questions on that? All right. Looks good. Looks like everybody is caught up. What is that? Can I? You mean in Kenya? Yeah, no, yeah, you can. You can actually have a concealed carry permit in Kenya. We do have clients that do it just because they're so used to having a carry permit from wherever they come from, but they don't typically carry for long. It's not the same. It's not the same as it is in America. But yeah, you can do like a shooting range business and all that. You can even do, like if you're a firearms dealer in the United States and you want to do like a federal firearms type of permitting, you can do that as well. You got to get licensed, of course, but you can do that. Entry level pricing. So, all right, the minimum that the government allows for you to purchase a bond is 50,000 Kenyan shillings, which is like somewhere in the neighborhood of $400, right? So that's the minimum. But when we do laddering, there are some things that we have to think about. One of them is amortization. A bond can be amortized, and what that means is, let's say you get a bond and you put I don't know, put $8,000 in it, which is like 100,000. I'm sorry, which is like that's 1 million. I'm sorry. So you put like $9,000 into it. It's like a million Kenyan shillings, right? And they say, okay, this thing it's an amortized, bond. So you put 1 million Kenyan shillings in it. As a matter of fact, to make all the math easy, we're going to call $10,000 1 million shillings. It's not, but that's what we're going to call it. All right. So you put 10,000 in, you got 1 million shillings. All right, cool. So now in the amortization, it's a 15-year bond, right? So what ends up happening is they say, hey, you have 1 million shillings. So you're part of the full maturity of this bond. Okay. So at year number 5 of the bond, we're going to give you back 500,000. You still have a 500,000 in, and you're still making the same interest rate on the 500,000 that you're in, but your principal just shrunk, right? You don't have 1 million in there anymore. You have a 500,000 in, right? But you're still making the same, whatever, 14%. All right, fine. Now you get that initial capital back. You go invest it somewhere else. The issue is that obviously maybe the current rates in 5 years aren't 14%. So maybe now you're down to regular bond rates of like 7%, right? So you got to find somewhere else to invest. All right, fine. But let's say that you came in and you got the minimum, the 50,000. At year 5, you get your 50,000 back. There's no here's half of it. That halving of the amortization starts at 1 million. And sometimes the wording is funky. So you'll see some bonds where it'll say anyone under 1 million will get all of their money back at the first amortization. And then other bonds, you'll see it'll say something that like 1 million and under, right? So which is it? If you have 1 million, you get your million back. You have to be over 1 million, right? So because of that discrepancy in the language, we always do 1,050,000, right? So our base is to keep you in the bond getting passive income for the full 20, 25, 30 years, right? So it's not that that's like the minimum or the entry level whatever, but for if we're doing a bond ladder, then the entry position on getting into that bond ladder is like 65,000 because you need 6 bonds. They pay out twice a year. So in order to have passive income every month of the year, you need 6 bonds, and they need to be strategically set in the ladder so that the first bond gives you January and July, the next bond gives you February and August, the next bond gives you March. You get what I'm saying, right? Each bond is going to pay out their ROI cut in half in 2 payments. You get the full payment for the year, but in 2 payments, 6 months apart. So if you want a ladder that's paying you passive income every single month, then that's what you got to do. And for now, because the bond interest is so high, we actually have relocation clients that buy the bond, buy a house, relocate, and then don't have to work another day in their life because they have 20 years of getting that payment every month. And the minimum payment that they're going to get is 50,000 shillings. So they're going to get 50,000, a month for the next 25 years and don't have to worry about anything, right? So that's how the amortization works. So as far as like entry pricing, it depends on what you're trying to do. Like if we have clients who just have the generational wealth trust, and the generational wealth trust is going to compound for the next generation. It doesn't benefit them financially in any way, shape, or form, right? But they also don't want it to be a burden, right? So it's like, all right, this trust isn't benefiting me, which is fine because it's for generational wealth. I get that. But I don't want to be sitting here pumping money into it, which also might create a tax issue for me because it might destroy the non-grantor status of the trust and turn it into a grantor trust because there's all this money being pumped in directly from a U.S. citizen or directly from the United States, right? So how do you solve that? You let the trust purchase a bond ladder. Now, it doesn't need the max bond ladder, right? Because it can get kicked out at year 5, which is fine because what ends up happening is every time you get a coupon payment, which is what a dividend from a bond is called, every time you get a coupon payment, you would take that coupon payment and put it into one of those special funds or whatever the greatest, investment of the time is, and you let that keep compounding because that's for the next generation. So it wouldn't necessarily have to be at that minimum level for amortization, right? You wouldn't necessarily need each rung on the ladder to be 1,000,000 shillings. You could let each rung on the ladder be 10,000 shillings, right? It's just going to affect the time it takes for the money in there to compound. That's all. The more money you start with, obviously, the better your compounding is. The lower the amount you start with, the lower the compounding is. But that doesn't matter. $100 can turn into $1,000,000. It's just going to take 300 years, right? But if it's a more reasonable amount, like if you start with $10,000, then you could get to $1,000,000 in say 28 years, right? So compounding is going to compound. It's going to do what it's going to do. And if you're not making any draws from that for the next generation, then you just set up your trust deed that once the bonds are done, if bond interest is at whatever rate above inflation, right? Because you wouldn't want to use a number. Because you say, okay, well, I want 20% returns. What if that's bad, 30 years from now, right? What if 30 years from now, everybody's getting 60% returns? And because it was good in the moment for you to say 20%, now you messed yourself up. So you always want to say, okay, this, range above inflation is the minimum range, and anything above that, then it's okay, reinvest in a bond. If not, then here are the parameters that I want you to look at to find the next best investment, right? And so that's just going to keep compounding over time. That's for your grandbabies or your babies or your whatever. And so that's real easy to do. Off of the bond ladder, then you definitely have to come in at a minimum, level to be able to have enough money to live. No, 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 because remember the trust is offshore, so the trust is a Kenyan. One of the things about the type of trust in Kenya that we use, and is one of the reasons why we use Kenya, is because every year per beneficiary you can do 10 million in distributions without having to pay any taxes on the Kenyan side, right? So that allows for the money going into the trust first not to create a taxable situation for you, up to 10 million, right? Beyond that, then it's a different story. And then there are things like FTC or FEIE, that eliminate foreign taxes, that eliminate foreign earned income from U.S. taxes rather. And so you can be in a situation where you end up being just completely tax exempt for the first 10 million in local currency that comes out of the trust, right? But also you could just have the bond paying you back directly because the bond comes to you after taxes anyway. The only issue there is the U.S. What the U.S. would want to tax you on that. That's something you got to sit down with a local person and figure out. Well, if you're planning on moving, then it makes sense to just let that money sit locally. You know what I mean? Just let it sit locally. And when you make your move, then there's just this heap of money sitting in an account that's been waiting for you for 2 years. You know what I mean? That makes sense. We got people who do that for 7 years because they'll start their Class K permit, and then maybe they still have some stuff that they want to do at home for the next 7 years, or maybe they like qualify for like Social Security in 7 years or whatever, right? So they're going to retire in 7 years. We've even had people who like they had 40, depending on what industry they're in, and they had 7 years until then. So they would hold their permit for those 7 years, and then be eligible to apply for dual citizenship almost immediately upon like permanent relocation here. And then they had 7 years of money sitting in an account that's been waiting for them and compounding, and building for them for all those 7 years. So it was like their initial investment was they almost made that much in ROI by the time they came to actually live here. So whoever plans the best does the best, right? So whoever is like, all right, I'm gonna plan and like pull the trigger on my plan, they always do the best. Hey, Christian, how are you? No, no, no. They use the latter as well because it's up to them, right? Because if you don't need it to live off of, you don't have to use the latter. I can't think of any recent clients who don't use the latter just because of how extraordinary the interest is right now. It doesn't make sense not to. Um, but they just don't spend the money right away. The people who are living here off the ladder are spending the money every month, the majority of it. Whatever's left over, maybe they're either saving it. Typically, they'll be told to like save until they have an emergency fund, so they have 6 months of their expenses saved up. And once they have the 6 months of their expenses saved up as an emergency fund, then they start investing the overages. Because like the longer you're here, kind of the less your cost of living is, right? So then they'll start investing the overages beyond that, but they're living off right away, right? So there's not a lot of compounding happening until they start investing the overages, and then you're only getting compound on like 20%, 30%, whatever the overages are, right? But for the folks who like they have time before they come, they're getting what's called like 100% drip, right? A dividend reinvestment program. So like all of the extra money that's coming out every month from the ladder, they're reinvesting all of it. But when they reinvest it, it's not a bond anymore. They're reinvesting in like a special fund or a REIT or something like that, something that's liquid. So they can just sell it anytime they want, get their money out, right? So when they do decide to come over, typically their trust account buys them the plane ticket. Like they got the money rolling in the trust account that the trust account like brings them over, and then they start, using those funds for daily life. There's quite a few people though, even though the funds are there for daily life, they still have a remote job or they still have a business or they still have Airbnbs or whatever, and they don't even use it. They just let it keep compounding, right? So it's like a safety net, but it's growing while they sleep. So there's a lot of folks that even though they could use it to live, they don't. They just let it keep compounding, and then really, really, really enjoy their retirement. So yeah, it's all whatever is the personal situation of the person. Cool, cool, you got it. All right. So we could hold on one second. This phone is in front of that screen. So we could, yes, you could essentially retire if you have the upfront money to do it. Now, the cost of life thing is typically tied to home ownership, right? So, like, we have an end of year special that we're running. There's only one left, but it's like 185. We build you a house, we do your immigration, we do the bond ladder, we do the trust formation, like we do everything, right? So you get here, you have a brand new house that's built from scratch, the whole all the things, and so now your cost of living is definitely below the 50,000. If you were renting like an apartment, the apartment might be 60,000, right? So now just because you're not a property owner, now monthly burn rate is way higher, right? So if you can do the upfront investment and not have the monthly burn rate, you're in a really good position. And then yeah, you could, just we get a lot of people who do that, especially like at that special price. There's a lot of people who were saving to buy a house, and they had that amount saved up, and then the BlackRock, thing happened, and they were buying single family homes at double asking price, triple asking price as a hedge against inflation, and so they weren't able to buy the house they wanted. They got stuck renting. And so they're like, well, wait a minute. We could literally take that, what was a down payment, build a brand new home on land that's included in the package. So we own the land, we own the brand new build, we own all of that. We have our immigration permits together. We got money coming in from the guaranteed from the government every single month, right? And it's more than our burn rate, right? So and we're talking about people who are like 35, right? We're talking about young people move here and never have to work again. Boom, that's it. You know what I mean? So yes, you could do that, but most of the people, they have something else. Most of the people, they have some other business, they have some other remote income, they have something else that they don't quit. And so they have a really really nice safety net where they don't have to work. So what we used to call fu money. Their boss talked to them the wrong way, then they're not finna take it anymore. It's like winning the lottery. They know they got this backup money, but a lot of people just keep making whatever they're making, or they rent out whatever they got. They got a condo or a house or whatever, they Airbnb it or whatever, and they keep that going anyway. So I would say out of most of the people who use the bond ladder, only like 10% actually depend on it, to just retire and live. Most people, even the people who quasi do that, they end up opening a business here once it's legal for them to do so. A lot of people who come here, they come here for dual citizenship. It's not legal for you to own a business on a residency permit. So once they get the dual citizenship and they're a dual citizen and they can own a business, that's when they would do. So that's still a 7-year wait. And unfortunately, there's like an influx of people right now. Oddly enough, seemingly from the UK, who are coming here and getting residency permits and then opening businesses and then talking about them online. And so that is not a good situation, because they might not get caught for like 5-6 years, and then as soon as they do, their bank accounts will be frozen. They'll be permanently banned from the country, and a lot of times they initiate the process that gets them caught. Right. So a lot of times they'll come here, they'll illegally operate in the country, they'll illegally be doing business in the country. Nobody will show up and say anything to them at first. And they'll have everything together, like their paperwork will be together. So they won't think that they're illegally doing it because they didn't seek professional guidance. So they'll have a formed company. And while they were forming a company, ain't nobody told them they couldn't do it. They'll have a tax ID number for the company. They'll have possibly a local business license. And ain't nobody told them nothing. And then they'll apply for dual citizenship. And then the dual citizenship background check will kick off and they'll be deported. And all their money, all their assets, all their cars, everything will be confiscated. All because, they try to go in somebody else's country, do what they want with no professional guidance whatsoever. And so it sucks, but these are the outcomes that we see when people don't plan. So like I said, the people who plan the best have the best outcomes. and it be the last employee you fired. But yeah, yeah, that happens too. You know, some employees not doing their job, you fire them, and all of a sudden you've been reported because they know you ain't got a permit. You know, yeah, 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 it happens. Well, because we have a law firm, we get to see the back end. So we get calls that have nothing to do with our regular lines of business because we have lawyers. So we'll get calls like, "Oh, I'm in jail. What can you come get me out?" Blah 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 blah. You know, and then so we get to see the nonsense that people are doing on the backside. One question to ask. Go ahead. Well, so that's actually the one thing that all immigration services have in common. All immigration services are mandated to protect local jobs, right? So you can't just come to a country where you're not a national and then, you know, say, hey, listen, um, I am now going to just work anywhere I want or open any business I want and take opportunity away from local people. You always have to get a permit in order to do something like that, right? Got to make sure that you get a permit. Yep, yep. It's part of the trust. Part of the trust planning, rather. Part of the trust planning. Yeah, it'll be a whole big thing. Like you'll do the consult, but then if you onboard, there's like multiple, you know, meetings because what'll end up happening is we'll have to work through the trust deed. Sometimes we do an entire family constitution, depending on what the person is trying to achieve. But we got to work through the trust deed. So that's going to take a couple sessions of being like, all right, what do you want? What protections do you want? What you know? What's this trust going to do for you in the end? And we have to put all of those tools directly into the trust deed, right? So anything that you want the trust to be able to do or to be able to protect you from or any of that has to be documented in the trustee. So that's a process where we'll go back and forth and like send it to you, and you can have local, you know, people look at it as well. Because depending on where the money is going, you might want your whoever your tax person is, whether they're a tax attorney or a CPA or an enrolled agent or tax strategist or whatever. You're going to want your local person to take a look at it if it's coming back to the United States for sure. But even if it isn't, if you're a U.S. citizen, you have to do a tax return every year, right? You don't have to pay taxes, but you have to do a tax return. You have to do, you know, you have to file your taxes every year, right? And so they'll let you know, what or from their side of things, especially you said that there was some real estate, so you're doing U.S. tax returns anyway. So from their side of things, they would let you know like what things they would want to see to help protect you on the IRS level and all of that. So we work together, right? We try not to work in an island. So we work together. We'll create, you know, the deeds and the documentations, and then you'll take them to your local people. And you know, if there's something that needs to be adjusted for IRC or something like that, then that adjustment will happen as long as it works under the local code as well, and we just go from there. So it's not like the consult's not the end; it's the beginning. All right. Hey, Miriam, how are you? Moja, how's it going? Mm, yeah, I mean you can do either. You can skip a generation. We have a lot of clients that skip a generation in the trust, right? So we have a lot of clients that do trust for their grandkids. Some of them it's a biblical thing. There's some part I used to know where it was. Somebody showed it to me. There's some part in the Bible that says a wise man leaves an inheritance for his children's children. So there's a lot of people who are like, the Bible has ordered me to leave a generational wealth trust for my grandkids. And so we get a lot of that. And then there are those who leave it for their children. The Really the primary factor is how fast are you compounding? Because if you're not compounding fast enough, your kids aren't really going to get anything out of the trust anyway. There's not going to be any money there, right? So, if you know people who don't have a ton of money, so they can't put like $50,000, into the trust, they will typically get a ladder. It might not be a max ladder like the people who are living off of it, because that's obviously more than $50,000. But they'll get a ladder of some sort, because the ladder will still increase the compounding by like 12 times, because you're getting 12 payments a month, right? So you'll get an increase in the compounding by having the ladder. So the ladder, even if it's not a max ladder, the ladder will still, push the trust forward. So the minimum ladder is what, 300,000 shillings? So 300,000 shillings, you're talking about like, I don't know, maybe 2500 or whatever to get that going. So because you have those payments coming in until amortization hits, which at the amortization, the initial money comes back to you anyway, right? And then you have regular compounding that's happening within the trust through regular investments beyond that. So that could jumpstart your trust to the point where your kids could benefit. Like there could be, 3.2 million in 15 years in that trust. And then your kids could actually benefit, even though you only started with like $3,000, right? But you need that really fast kind of compounding effect in order to even do that. So if you don't have that fast kind of compounding effect, but you're still only starting with like 3 grand or something like that, now you're talking about it taking like 60 years for it to get to a point where there's any kind of like serious substance in that trust. So now it makes sense for it to be like, all right, this is for my kids' not for my kids. But we get a lot of both. What Bible? Come on, dude. Google it. I'll Google it for you. What was it? Uh, a wise man giveth an inheritance to his children's children. It's Proverbs 13:22. I didn't even know it existed until Christians started showing up like, the Bible has ordered me. I was like, what? It's Proverbs 13:22. Yeah, no, there's people who are like seriously into their faith. So they read that one night during Bible study and start Googling, and then they find us. And I hear you guys set up generational wealth trust. Bible said. So yeah, there's a lot of that. Yeah, I mean, grandparents typically also have more money, you know, because like a solid starting place as far as funding the trust is like 10 grand, right? So, and then the trust itself costs like six. So you're talking about like 16 grand. But like a real solid like starting place is like 10 grand. You start with 10 grand, it won't take very, very long to compound that money. So you can do something in definitely in 30 years. You can have some level of substance there within that 30 years. But like I always say, the money is actually the easiest part of this thing, right? If you really want to do generational wealth, your focus has to be on the education per generation. That's the thing that's really, really, really going to make sure that you have generational wealth, because it's 70% of generational wealth is depleted in the second generation. And the people who are in that 70%, they don't pass on education to the next generation. So that, you know what I mean? That's what you definitely want to look at, is the education. If you're not focused on the education, your generational wealth is going to die out. It's unfortunate, but that's just what's going to happen. Well, yeah, even after the second generation, there's another, what is it, 20 or 25%? So total, if you count to the third generation, 90%. It's 90% total that their legacy falls apart because they're not focused on education. Right? So our generational wealth trust, education is built into the trust. You don't even qualify to be a beneficiary if you're not receiving financial literacy, if you're not receiving, investment education, if you're not receiving um, whatever education is important to the person above and beyond the financial education that's necessary, right? So sometimes it's fine arts, right? Sometimes it's music, sometimes it's STEM, and all of that. So there's education above and beyond, but it's not necessarily collegiate. That's not necessarily what it is. It's about having social capital and cultural capital, right? So social capital is spent outside of the family. Cultural capital is spent inside of the family. Okay? And these things will set the tone for how the family grows, what they're capable of. And it happens from birth, right? It starts immediately upon that child, being born and going from there, right? And so it just is what it is. They're you're good, and that's how classes are born, essentially, right? So depending on what the the habitus of the family is, that's going to determine whether or not the family is kind of welcome into a certain class, social class, not even necessarily social economic, but a social class moving forward, right? And so that's a different live altogether, but that's the actual hard part in generational wealth, is building those things, and those things take intention, understanding. It's a daily process, so our child is so different than the other children in his age group already, and he's 21 months old, already extraordinarily different than most of his age peers, right? And that comes from the cultural currencies and the habitus and the academic dispositions that we create within the home, right? So very, 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 very different, and you can see it, But again, that's a whole live in and of itself. So that's a live for another time. But just know that the hard part is the education. The easy part is the money. The money just has to compound. That's easy. Very, very easy. If somebody asks a question that I'm not answering, TikTok has told me that some of the comments in this live were filtered to protect the community experience. So you said it the wrong way, or you used some weird word that TikTok didn't like. So I have not seen your comment. TikTok completely blocked it. So if there's something that you're waiting for me to answer, think about what you wrote, say it a different way, and ask your question again. Oh, was it? I don't know. All right. There's probably like one word or something. It happens. Just go back, look at what you wrote, I guess, and figure out which word it was that TikTok had an issue with. Oh, yeah, I don't know. It came up this time. Yeah, no, definitely lack of financial literacy in our community. However, those stats were not for our community. 70%. Now, and mind you, these are the people who engaged in generational wealth. In our community, a lot of people talk about it and never do anything about it, right? So these are the people who actually created generational wealth. So already we're at 10%, 15% of the population, right? So the people who actually did it, they didn't just talk about it, they was about it, right? They did it. In the second generation, 70% of them, the money's gone. So those are the people who actually put up or shut up, right? But it's because they were too focused on money. They were too focused on generational wealth means money, 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 right? And so because of that, the education wasn't there, and probably because they didn't even have the education themselves, which is why, like, we had an outstanding governess. Unfortunately, life happens, and we pay really, really well. So she was able to, go do whatever it was that she needed to do in life, and no, no hate against that. Go ahead and step up your life in any way you need to. But it put us in a situation where we now have to replace her and get a new governance. But having all of your employees and all of that stuff, your household employees, in alignment with whatever culture you're passing on is super important as well, right? So now our son is 21 months old, not very old at all, just started talking, but even though he just started talking, if I speak to him in Swahili, he answers me in Swahili. If I speak to him in Mandarin Chinese, he answers me in Mandarin Chinese. If I speak to him in English, he answers me in English, right? He's been to China, and he's gone to cultural locations in China, right? On the plane, there were other kids on the plane. Every single one of them had an iPad. They were all doing something in a screen. He had a book. Can't read. He's looking at the pictures in the book, right? But there's a different cultural currency that's being passed on within the house that's setting him apart already, right? He's already asking questions, and he's not doing the asking the same question over and over again, because the answers he gets are satisfying, right? When he asks a question, we engage him as best as we can, and he does not have command of the language yet. Sometimes he only knows, like, he doesn't know the word for chicken in English. He only says chicken in Swahili and Chinese, right? So, like, he's 21 months old, right? But the cultural dispositions that are being passed on in the house are part of the education that will allow him to maintain the generational wealth, right? That's the hard part. It's every day, because he's watching and listening to everything, and we slip. We're not perfect, right? So we slip from day to day, and he hears something he shouldn't have heard, or he sees something that we didn't really want him to see, right? Now we're in a situation where we have to get a new governess. Is the new governess's English going to be good enough, like the old governess? Does the new governess understand the concepts that we're utilizing? Does the new governess understand different educational concepts, right? Like our old governess, they knew what Waldorf was, knew what IB was, knew what Montessori was, right? She knew all of these things, right? So she ran things properly and in accordance with what we want to see for our next generation. So all of these things are super difficult and super important in real generational wealth. It's not just the money, which is why the worst plan somebody could have is I'm going to make a bunch of money and leave an inheritance, and that's my generational wealth. No, generational wealth is grounded in stewardship. If you don't know what stewardship is, you're not passing on generational wealth. You're going to be one of those statistics that 70% are out of money in the second generation, and then an additional percentage by the third. Now, past the third, you're typically good. Past the third, you've essentially proven that you're passing on the right things. That because the second could be a fluke, right? You could own a property and there's oil under the property. We're good for another generation, right? So the second could be a fluke. It's very, very rare that you get two flukes in a row. So yeah, definitely education, but not just the financial. The financial literacy is the bare minimum, right? They got to be literate about what money actually is and how it actually works. Bare minimum. From there, the rest of the education really, really leans on the household, and it really, really leans on the dispositions that you create in that child by the time they're 5, right? But I'll give you a really good example. There are two kids sitting at a dinner table, right? One kid says, "Mom, why do I have to eat these vegetables?" And mom says, "Because they're good for you, just eat it." Okay? Fine. Next house, kid says the exact same thing. "Mom, why do I have to eat these vegetables?" And mom says, "Well, what is it that you think that vegetables do for you?" And kid says, "I don't know. What do they do?" And mom starts breaking down nutrition and how it works and how it makes you strong and how it affects your brain and how it affects your body. And now they're learning partners, right? And kid feels vindicated in asking the question. Now, kid number 1 and kid number 2, cognitive abilities 100% the same. But one is being taught an academic disposition, and the other one is being taught that maybe the questions you ask don't really matter, or maybe the answers you get from them don't really have substance. Just keep your head down and bow to authority, right? Which is great if you're going to be a line worker at Ford, which is fine. You could. That's not a bad job, right? If you're going to make parts on an assembly line, do what your manager tells you to do. Don't ask questions. That works for you. That's a great tool set to have for that particular class of person. But if that's not what you're going to do, if you're going to do something that requires leadership, if you're going to do something that requires ownership and equity and the responsibilities that go along with that, then maybe you should have a disposition towards education, that education works for you, that you have the right to ask questions, and that you can have the expectation that whoever is supposed to be in a position of information, giver, is actually your partner and not some authoritarian that's above you in some odd way, right? So it's completely different. Those two people walk into a boardroom completely different. Those two people have different expectations on what kind of rooms that they deserve to be in, right? Without even thinking about it. It's just a disposition that was created at home before long, but so long ago they can't remember it. Most people can't remember anything past age 4, right? So long ago they can't even remember when the disposition was created, right? That's stewardship. You were stewarding the next generation, right? That's part of it anyway, a very small part of it, but that's part of it. That's what generational wealth is built on. That's why the money people, they just never last. It always falls apart for them. Because the smallest, most insignificant part of generational wealth and the easiest part is the money. Always has been. Right? So that's that. So we get into I don't know, a a social dispositions live. All right. Anything else on this? I veered off Long enough. I digress. Anything else on business ownership, mergers, acquisitions, turnkey investments, legitimate passive investments? Most things that people call passive are not passive. If you are in a legitimate passive investment, you are probably a limited partner. So if you don't know what an LP is, probably not passive. Airbnb is not passive. Renting out real estate is not passive, right? You can work to the point where it becomes like a royalty and it feels passive, but something's going to break. And somebody got to fix it, right? You can have systems in place where you don't really feel it anymore, and so you can work up to a place where it operates as passive, but it's not a passive stream of income from the jump. It's not a passive investment, right? Typically, your passive investments exist in a space of limited partnership. So syndications are legitimate passive investment and typically regulated to be so by law, right? So if you're a limited partner, you give money, you are not legally allowed to work no matter what happens. You get money in your mailbox from the money you gave. That is passive income, right? That's real passive income. Okay, you do not work, and not only do you not work, you are not allowed to work. It is illegal. That is passive income. Bonds, passive income. Stocks, passive income. The only thing with those is, well, on the stock side especially, is you can't guarantee the income. On the bond, you are guaranteed the income if it's a treasury bond, unless the government disappears, in which case you have much bigger concerns than your passive income. But yeah, bonds, stocks, passive income, right? Royalties are kind of like what happens with real estate. You can get real estate to the point where you have a property manager and you have a maintenance man on site and you have, a workshop internally and you make your own pipe fittings and all of that stuff and you fix everything internally and it's part of, the machine and you never get a phone call, right? You just get your dividends as the owner of the company or however you pull your salary or whatever. So then it gets to a point where you scale it to passive income, right? But it didn't start as a passive investment. Royalties are the same way. You're gaining royalties on something you did, right? So you worked initially, right? You made the song and you performed it. And then every time they play the song for Christmas, you get a royalty. Or every time it's in a movie, you get a royalty, right? So you work once and get paid multiple times off of working once. It's closer to passive income than real estate because real estate, you actually keep working or somebody is working on your behalf, right? But with royalties, you work one time and get paid multiple times for the one time that you worked. So it's closer to passive income than something like real estate would be, right? But passive income is actually pretty rare. So either you're a limited partner or you own equity or you're selling debt, right? Which bonds, you're the bank and bonds are debt, right? The government is actually borrowing from you. They're treating you as the bank, right? So that's how passive income works in reality. There might be some obscure one that I'm forgetting, but it's very very rare. Passive is very very rare. So syndications is really like the most recognized way to get passive income. You can do a non-syndication partnership. Like you can create, so like there are LPs and GPs, limited partners and general partners, right? In the syndication. But there's actually a business structure called a limited partnership, right? So it's like an LLC. You can get an LP, right? And in that limited partnership, you would have LPs and GPs. You have general partner and limited partner, right? As an actual physical business structure, right? So you wouldn't have an LLC or a C corp or an S corp. You would have a limited partnership. That would be the name of the business structure. So you can actually structure your business where there are people making passive income off of the business and they just give money and they just get paid. And there are people working the business, right? And in that structure, typically the people working the business put no money in. They put in sweat equity. They work the business. For the people who have money, who put all the money in, and they get their returns. That the mailbox money, as we call it, they get passive income, right? And the standard split for that is 70-30. The people working get 30%. The people who are getting the passive income get 70% of the equity. And then you have an exit event. And in that exit event, the business is sold, right? Or the limited partners are cycled out or are bought out essentially, right? So the general partners could go and get a loan for 70% of what the business is worth, right? And because they own the other 30%, they can put up their 30% as part of that loan and pay off the 70%. Now they own all of it, but they have a loan they need to pay back. If the business is profitable enough, why not? Like if you know you're going to be able to pay back that loan because you're the one operating it and it's profitable enough, then you can do that. Okay, so there's an opportunity for the 30% GPs to exit the LPs, right? But there's an exit event regardless, right? Somebody else comes in and buys whatever it is, and then that 70-30 split happens in the equity. Hey, Safe Space, how's it going? Thanks for that. So, LPs, most people who have passive income, they're LPs, or they have stock, if they have stock or bonds or whatever, or, options or derivatives or any of that, they could be making passive income as well. Oh, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. I think we're wrapping it up. I don't see any new questions popping up, so I think we're almost done. Geez, I've been here for 2 hours and 24 minutes. I do not see any additional questions. Looks like we're almost done here. Any additional questions? If you're asking a question now, just press enter, and then I'll just wait for you to go back and correct it. If you're about to ask a question, just throw me a 1 in the chat, and I'll wait. But I think we're done. Looks like we're good. All right, guys, I will see you guys same time tomorrow. Always a pleasure to hang out with the Freedom family. And tomorrow, I don't know what the topic is tomorrow, but it'll be in the title of the live. And I will see you guys tomorrow morning for me, but tomorrow night for you guys. All right, see you guys later. Thanks for stopping through.